Everybody. Can you hear me through this mic? Perfect. I'm Stephen Herreid. Thank you all for coming. We are The People. Greatest name for a group ever. The People. Thank you for the applause already. Very good. Off to a great start. That's right. Also laugh if I tell any jokes. I'll signal. I wanted to tell you a little bit about The People and also explain what's going on tonight with our lovely speaker here and why we are presenting as we are. The People are dedicated to educating ourselves and other members of the community about valuable truths that will bring about change for the better in local politics. We believe in conservative and Christian values, but in this day and age, I think oftentimes words like conservative and Christian values are greatly misunderstood. So we, the people, it feels good to say, we, the people, understand that America at its core is a conservative and a Christian nation, right? So when we talk about educating ourselves and others about these truths, really all we're talking about is relearning the things that have always inspired the greatest chapters of the American story from the start, all along. So, why are we hosting sessions on the topic of socialism and authoritarianism? Right? These things are antithetical to the American way of life, right? I've stumped myself. No, I'm just kidding. Well, actually, as we're going to be learning, we can learn a lot about ourselves from socialism, even though it is antithetical. When we look at the alternatives to the American way of life, it can help us to fully understand and appreciate the great things that we have inherited as people in America. So let me explain a little bit about that. Socialism has recently been growing in popularity, especially among young Americans. There was a poll, a YouGov poll, 2019, that found that 70% of millennials and 64% of Generation Z said they would vote for a socialist candidate. Those are huge majorities of Generation Z, Generation Millennial. My generation, by the way, I'm a millennial. Sorry to say. But just a few months later, a Venezuelan polling firm found that a supermajority of Venezuelans who are living under the Venezuelan socialist regime, 77%, actually more than 77% of them, did not want their country to be socialist. So, again, millennials, 70% would vote for a socialist in the US. Over 77% of Venezuelans said they did not want their country to be socialist. What do you think the biggest difference is between those Venezuelans and the American young people? Sorry? They're not educated? That's a really good answer because it really lines up with the mission I just mentioned. Yes, they're not educated. The Americans don't know socialism firsthand, do they? Now, this isn't to judge. A lot of the reasons, by the way, that Generation Z and millennials will give about why they are disenchanted with capitalism and want to see more socialism and they're interested in socialism, the reasons they'll give is they'll talk about, oh, we are getting appropriations for Social Security that we might never actually get payouts from. We've been encumbered or, burdened with all of these college debts that are really artificially inflated. I don't know if we'll ever be able to pay them off. Some of their complaints actually might be valid. And we should work to address them, actually. We should have conversations about those things. But the question we're going to consider tonight is socialism the solution? I think no. Hope you agree. Now, I mentioned that Venezuelans are opposed to socialism now, according to polling from just last year. Not to judge, again, the American young people who are attracted to socialism. It's worth pointing out that Venezuelans, just a few years ago, according to polling, growing numbers of them were pro-socialism. But then their country went socialist. And now they're living under the socialist regime, and I'll tell you a little bit about what that's like. Here's a quote from a report from last year. Quote, according to a recent survey by 3 independent universities in Caracas, 96% of Venezuelans now live below the poverty line. More than 5 million have fled the country's painful economic conditions, making Venezuela the largest migration crisis in the modern history of Latin America. Isn't that crazy? 96%. Most people in Venezuela are living in poverty now. And that's not the people pushing conservative ideas on you. That's totally a mainstream set of numbers. In fact, the quote that I just read you came from CNN. Not from the people, not from whatever partisan source, although you might say CNN is partisan if you're like me. So yes, I think I also want to mention that our American heritage is rich and diverse. We've had movements in the past that have introduced seemingly new ideas that have transformed our country in some ways for the better, including the abolitionist movement and later on the civil rights movement. These were movements, though, that didn't introduce things that violate the American way of thinking or our traditions. In fact, instead, actually, they drew from them, from the wisdom of the ages, and from the truths that we, the people as a group, want to promote, educate ourselves in, educate each other in, like we're going to do tonight. So, for example, they drew from the declaration principle, the founding principle of our country, that all men are created equal before God, and they argued persuasively that therefore we should be equal before the law. Now, equality before the law means freedom, freedom to pursue happiness according to your own choices in your own way, without infringements or restrictions that are state-sanctioned, that hold you back, right? And one more little anecdote I just want to drop on you. I called a friend yesterday as this event was approaching. I thought socialism, my friend would have some things to say about this, because I remembered my friend took a trip to Cuba in his early 20s. It was actually, during the embargo, he went to Cuba, believe it or not. It was an educational trip, supposed to be, funded surreptitiously by a leading, very famous Democrat, Bernie Sanders. And he went there, the idea was for him to learn about how wonderful Cuba was under the socialist regime, right? I called him, I said, buddy, remember that trip you took in Cuba? Did that change any of your thinking about socialism? Without missing a beat, immediately he replied, 100%. So before he went to Cuba, he was an avowed socialist, believed in it. One of the first things he noticed, he told me, when he got to Cuba was the inequality. There were two separate spaces everywhere he went. One for rich, usually white people from Canada, from the UK, tourists. And Cuban officials made sure that they got waited on, they got their every wish, right? But my friend is a scrappy fella, and he would sneak away from these carefully curated areas run by the propagandists for the socialist regime and talk to real Cubans. And he discovered that they were very poor. He told me that whether you were a doctor or just a guy who mowed lawns, you made the same amount of money, which is about the equivalent, he said, of $40 per month. You can't live on that. He also mentioned that public transit didn't work. He said public transit could take 18 hours to get the equivalent of a 2-hour car drive away, because everything was always breaking down. He said nothing worked there except the gray economy. The gray economy is what they call the free market, which is basically people doing what they want, doing trade under the counter, under the table. So people there would sell cigars or drugs or even their own bodies, just to scrape together enough independent wealth to send care packages or make phone calls to their loved ones in places like Miami. In order to pursue happiness, they had to live against the law. There was no equality before the law there. My friend was disgusted. I'm glad he jumped the fence, right, and talked to these ordinary people in Cuba. That is what set my friend apart from many others in his corrupt generation, to use a biblical phrase, right? He's a millennial. He set himself apart, and all he had to do was listen to ordinary people who have experienced authoritarianism. And that really set him up, by the way, for great success. He's married, lots of kids, great job. He's the American dream incarnate. And what set him straight, first of all, was listening to people who actually experienced socialism. So that brings us back to tonight. Our speaker, Juliet, we won't name her fully because that wouldn't be safe, because socialism is dangerous. But Juliet is here. She's from the Philippines. The Philippines currently, of course, has a self-proclaimed socialist president, but she'll tell us much more about that. Juliet has some documents right here. They're not for you to take, but for you to look over. You can peruse them, especially later in the evening. And after she gives her talk, Juliet is willing to take questions as well. Keep in mind, Juliet's just an ordinary person, like I was just talking about. She's not some sort of public speaker or traveling pundit. So we're going to listen to her very honest, personal story from experience and what she has to say about authoritarianism and socialism tonight. And hopefully we will all be as transformed by this wonderful speaker as my friend was way back in the early 2000s. Thank you very much.